You're listening to the Communications Business Advisor podcast, the podcast for communications professionals in the corporate world who are committed to advancing their work and our field's reputation as critical business advisors that are not only invited to the decision-making table, but are required there. I'm your host, Tara McDonagh. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Communications Business Advisor podcast. Today, we're going to talk about reporting structures. Specifically, does reporting structure matter for communications teams? Most of you will scream yes, and you'll scream it loudly. And then some of you might share stories about how messed up the reporting structure is for communications in your organization, or how it used to be in some prior role or company. The exception is those of you who work in a centralized comm structure where the top comms person reports to the CEO. You're probably thrilled with the structure. So what do I think about reporting structure and its impact on the effectiveness of communications? Well, it's complicated. And I feel like I'm posting a relationship status on Facebook when I say that. Circa wouldn't be 1900s. It would be like 2009. Do you remember that? That it's complicated relationship status? Did anyone actually post it's complicated as a status unless they wanted drama, by the way? Well, I don't want drama here, but I am probably going to say some provocative things to get those brains going. So buckle up and get ready. Speaking of provocative, I recently posted on LinkedIn with an opening line asking the question, should legal report to communications? Yes, you heard that right. Should legal report to communications? People lost their minds. Within an hour, I had a ridiculous number of comments, and those who didn't read the whole post were getting up in arms about even the possibility that this would be stated out loud. The audacity, as the kids say. Those who did read it all knew that I wasn't being serious, but I wanted people to think through the concept because there's a point behind the statement. Stay with me here. Communications often prevents a crisis by editing a business decision along the way to meet the business goal, but we do so in a way that won't cause reputational, operational, or often regulatory and legislative risk. I have a ton of examples of this in my own career, and it's probably the most advanced way someone can show up as a communications business advisor. And I know I'm not the only one out there who's done this in their career. There's probably plenty of you that have plenty of examples. And communications also manages through a crisis when it shows up. Sometimes that's because we weren't at the table when the decisions were being made, and sometimes because it was an issue that wasn't preventable. Legal does the same. It both advises on risk using the legal lens, and it manages through the crisis when it shows up. So then, why would legal report to communications? Exactly. Using that same logic, why would communications report to legal? They're both critical functions doing similar things, yet one of those scenarios is far more likely than other in reporting relationships. Comms is far more likely to report to legal, though it's not the most prevalent structure. And I have never heard of a scenario where legal reports to comms. If you've heard of one, come over on my LinkedIn and let me know, because I've never heard of it. Again, both business areas are critical to the business's success, but why does the corporate world weigh one as more important than the other? Why is legal viewed as more critical than comms? Even more than that, why do some of us in communications regard legal as more important too? Are you still with me out there? I hope so. The point isn't that one business area should report to the other. The point is that in a corporate environment, organizations put general counsel at that critical table in a top position, but communications has to build the case to be considered at that table and then continue to build that case over and over and over again. We're peers and partners. One area is not superior to the other. So on that note, how does this relate to other reporting relationships that are much more prevalent in communications? I mean, legal and comms don't often have a reporting relationship. So what do we see often? Well, we often see that internal comms reports into HR. Public relations will report into marketing. Investor relations into finance. Public affairs or government relations into legal. Executive communications is handled in silos, often by an executive's chief of staff, where their assistants or occasionally it's dumped on internal comms to take care of, but of course without additional resources to handle it. Corporate citizenship is often not a thing at all, or if it is, it's focused on community relations and it has no business strategy behind it. The various aspects of communications become a dumping ground within a company, and every single, for lack of a better term, let's call them parent functions, only because that's the only way I know how to describe it right here, and that's how they think of it. Like HR, marketing, finance, they think that they know what communications should be doing, yet they only see it through the lens of their own expertise, not the broader expertise of what being a communications advisor looks like. So, am I a fan of a centralized communications function? Well, I'd swear here with an F-bomb followed by a yes here, but this is a clean rated podcast, so I'll just say yes. Emphatically, yes. When you have a holistic view of the audiences and how each connects to the business goals, operations, and decisions being made, the organization benefits immensely. Full stop. However, that doesn't mean that a centralized function works for every organization. Nor does it mean that you cannot be successful in an organization where comms functions are in different business areas. This is where it gets complicated. So if you're in internal comms, for example, and you report to HR, it does not mean that your work is to just do whatever the CHRO thinks is important and to take all of your direction from them. If you're at the director level or above, your role is much bigger. Your CHRO has an important piece of the internal comms experience, but what you do is broader than that. Employees also need to know about what they're selling, how the company is showing up externally, what the company is doing in the community, client relationships and growth, business goals and how they show up in action, and much, much more. Every business area leader is equally important because every business area is important. Every business area has things going on that the employees should know about. But when you're focused on pleasing the CHRO, you miss the boat. Now, hopefully your CHRO sees this broader view of internal communications and knows that you need to have a tight relationship with all executive leaders. Hopefully they know what they don't know and that you need to be there with them in that decision-making table. Hopefully they see your value and they know that if they try to dictate your work, it will miss a major portion of your purpose. And then you'll just get annoyed and leave. But here's the big but here. If they don't see it, if they don't treat you like this, it's on you to teach them. Does that suck for you? Yes. But this is the reality of our misunderstood and oversimplified field. You advocate for the employee. You meet the business goals where the audience need is, whether that's on an HR-related topic or a crisis or a product launch or whatever. It's about the goal, not pleasing the business area, even if it's technically your own business area. Using your inform and influence skills is critical here to keep advocating instead of throwing your hands up in frustration or having a head meet desk moment. And I don't say this lightly because it is wildly frustrating to feel like you're constantly educating and advocating and teaching without schooling people on your misunderstood and wildly oversimplified field. Constantly attempting to convince people how valuable your role is can sometimes feel like shouting into the abyss. But where you could get stuck here is giving into that frustration instead of laughing it off. You could wind up just throwing your hands up and start taking orders because it's too hard to advocate. But please don't go there. And if you're already there, reach out to me. I'd like to help you regain your spark for this very cool field we're in. Though there are some things that aren't in your control, there are plenty of things that are. Advocacy is critical, and you know how to do this. Push the envelope even when it's exhausting. Get others to speak up on your behalf. Show where things went wrong and what you do differently next time, and ask them what they would do differently too. All of this is part of elevating your function, yourself, your team, and even our entire field, because you're the power of example. And once people see what a real business advisor in comms looks like, they expect it. And that can only help all of us who truly know our stuff in this field. So on to another point. Let's talk about the other times it makes sense for reporting structures to work differently. To not have a centralized corporate communications or corporate affairs function. But first, we're going to take a break for this message. It'll be quick. The Communications Business Advisor podcast is brought to you by Raise the Tide, the program for women communications leaders and emerging leaders working in the corporate environment. Raise the Tide is part community, part coaching, part professional development, and part mentorship. The program advances women in their careers and activates these trailblazers to advance our vision of a corporate world that not only invites communications leaders to act as critical advisors, but expects them to. A rising tide raises all ships, but we're not the ships. Together, we're the force of the tide raising the ships for our entire industry. For more information, visit www.raisethetide.net. Okay, we're back. When does not having a centralized communication structure make sense? Well, first, size of the company matters. If you're a small but growing entity, you might not have the business need for a cohesive comms function yet. Often, PR is the first comms hire, and they can be folded into marketing with the right level of advisory support from an agency or a consultant or related team member. Then you might need to hire an internal comms staff member, and that initial need is usually very HR driven. It's a lot about benefits and whatnot at that point. But then right around that time you're ready to hire a third person, I'd argue that's around the time to centralize into a central comms function with a leader overseeing it who has expertise in the corporate communications field. Highly complex organizations tend to get this first. Those that deal with a ton of regulations, potential crisis issues, public outcry, and similar. Think of industries like healthcare, energy, finance. They tend to get it. Organizations in the consumer sphere tend to maintain separation until they get around to $1 billion in revenue or so. And sometimes they hang on to that old structure because it works until a crisis hits. This is because communications is often seen as a function of marketing and sales inside consumer-driven organizations. The PR role is primarily about telling the stories needed to sell rather than to protect the brand from reputational issues. That's changing in this day and age, so it's one of those rare situations where the B2B world can lead the B2C world, and the B2C world can follow B2B. Okay, so a smaller size organization could mean that PR reports to marketing and internal comms reports to HR, and that could work fine for that stage of development. But there should be a plan for what it looks like when the company grows to a certain revenue point. For example, if you know your goal is to double revenue in 5 years, your company team and structure won't look the same. What will it look like, and how would you grow and organize it differently? This is something I do when I advise on comm structures and growth in my audits and structure work, because you have to have a blueprint for the future, even if it changes over time. A vision to work toward is important. We've also covered how consumer businesses often separate the comms function. They may not have a public affairs, executive comms, or community relations function, but they most certainly will have a PR and internal comms function if they're a certain size, typically around $500 million and more in revenue. That dictates that both of these roles would be in place inside a company, and often way earlier in that revenue stage, especially for PR. There are other scenarios where comms could be centralized, but report to someone other than the CEO also, like maybe the COO or the head of strategy. Maybe because they're learning and growing and they're the next in line for that CEO role. Maybe the comms group reports into a chief administrative officer who has HR, comms, and marketing all within their sphere. There are plenty of ways that it could occur and that it can absolutely work, especially if the communications leaders are given autonomy and agency to have relationships with people internally at the EVP level and to have authority to speak up, no matter what their own title says or who they report to. A client of mine who's a COO says that he wants, quote, strong opinions from his comms leader. I've questioned if it's okay for that comms leader to disagree with him in an environment where with his peers. And he said yes. That's the kind of agency I'm talking about. If you get caught without that agency and autonomy, that is where the reporting structure can really derail things. On that note, let's get back to the crux of the original question. Does reporting structure matter? Yes, especially if the communications lead role is in conflict with the person from the business area they report to. If you're an internal comms leader and you report to HR, they don't really know what it is that you do. Sorry, but that's a fact. They did not grow up in a comms position. They grew up in an HR position, which is a very different skill, degree, and overall function. So as a result, though they may be supportive boss and overall happy to give you free rein to define the function and handle the relationships and the work that's needed, there will still be problems. For example, you will be last on their list of budget additions and first on the list of cuts. They fundamentally know why they need an HRIS system or why they need another headcount for recruiting. They do not understand why they need more money and staff behind internal communications because they've never done it. So you're immediately put in a position of both education and advocacy, where your peers in HR are only focused on the advocacy part. Take that then into marketing, same thing. They might know that they need PR, but they just don't know why they need this wild investment in issues and crisis response. Can't you just create some sort of playbook and then focus on the proactive work of pitching our product? Yikes. I know. Outside of budget, it also shows up with counsel. Imagine if you're asked by the CEO in a room with your boss what you think about something. And what you think is fundamentally different from what your boss in HR or marketing thinks. You then have a choice to make. Do you advocate for what you believe the right thing is for the business and take your chances with your boss? Or do you get uncomfortable and share what you know your boss wants you to say? It's dicey. And that's another reason it really doesn't make sense to bury communications leaders inside an organization. If you have the kind of leader who tells you that they want you to speak up, even if it's counter to what they'd advise, that's great. But it's also rare. And CEOs shouldn't assume that their leaders are those kind of people. So instead of asking why comms shouldn't be buried in reporting structures under other functions, let's ask why they should. Okay, so reporting structure matters. But it isn't an excuse to throw your hands up and say things are unfixable or unworkable. It also doesn't always mean a centralized comms function is the answer, especially for smaller companies. So please keep on advocating on your end and I'll do the same. We can ignite a movement when we share a message. And on this note of reporting structures, another related structural conversation is if communications roles should be embedded in the business areas or if they should be centralized in the communications function. But I've shared enough on this topic of structure already. So if you want to know more about my thoughts on embedded comms versus central comms, sign up for my new Level Up emails. It's for those of you who want extra insights on comms related topics. We're starting with additional thoughts from myself and others in the field about topics we cover here in the podcast. So if you want those extra insights, sign up for Level Up. Be extra. We'll put the link in the show notes. And if you like this episode, please share a rating or a review. It helps people find us. Until next time, you've listened to the Communications Business Advisor podcast. Talk with you next time. If you're interested in working with me to advance your work and your team's reputation as critical business advisors, never order takers, check out TaraMcDonagh.com. Thanks for listening to the Communications Business Advisor podcast. If you found this episode helpful, please leave a rating or a review. It helps people find us, and we can't ignite a movement without sharing the message. See you next time, where we'll continue to do the work to elevate our field's reputation and elevate the careers of the people in it.